They did not notice the moment when it began, because nothing truly dramatic happened at first. There was no announcement, no shouting, no warning bell. Papers were stamped, chairs were pushed back from desks, clocks continued their slow, patient movement across office walls. Outside, the streets of Washington, D.C. sounded exactly as they always had. Carriages in earlier years, automobiles later, footsteps, distant voices, the ordinary noise of a nation that believed itself awake. Yet what was unfolding was one of the quietest and most influential forces in American history, the slow construction of a system so large, so detailed, and so methodical that no single person ever fully understood it while it was being built. This is a true story, and it is not a story of heroes, battles, or speeches. It is the story of process. In the late 19th century, the United States was changing in a way that most citizens could not see. The country had expanded westward, railroads stitched distant towns together, factories multiplied, and cities grew upward and outward. With growth came complexity. With complexity came paperwork. And with paperwork came a problem that seemed small at first, almost laughably boring. There was too much information. By the 1880s, the federal government was drowning in records, census data, land claims, military pensions, shipping logs, tax forms, immigration manifests, millions upon millions of documents stacked in rooms never meant to hold them. Clerks copied numbers by hand, line after line, day after day. Errors were common. Processing was slow. The census of 1880 took nearly 8 years to tabulate completely, by which time much of the data was already outdated. No one panicked. They simply worked longer hours. The census was supposed to be a snapshot of the nation, taken every 10 years, as required by the Constitution. It determined congressional representation, federal funding, and political power. But by the time the 1890 census approached, officials quietly realized something unsettling. If population growth continued at its current pace, the data might never be processed before the next census arrived. This was not a dramatic realization. It was discussed in committee rooms, in memos, in understated conversations between men who wore similar suits and spoke in careful tones. They did not frame it as a crisis. They framed it as a logistical inconvenience. One of these men was named Herman Hollerith. Hollerith was not a revolutionary in temperament. He was methodical, reserved, and deeply interested in efficiency. While working as a statistician for the Census Bureau, he noticed something that others accepted without question. The human body was being used as a machine, and it was a poor one for the task. Hands grew tired, eyes strained, minds drifted. Hollerith did not ask how to make clerks work faster.
He asked how to remove them from the calculation entirely. His idea was deceptively simple. Data could be encoded, not written. Information could be punched into cards, not copied into ledgers. Machines could count, sort, and tabulate faster than any human ever could, and they would never grow bored. The punched card was not new. It had been used in textile looms to control weaving patterns. Hollerith adapted the concept, transforming it from an industrial curiosity into a tool of administration. Each hole represented a piece of information: age, sex, marital status, place of birth. Cards could be stacked, fed into machines, sorted with astonishing speed. When the Census Bureau tested Hollerith's machines for the 1890 census, the results were quietly astonishing. What had once taken years could now be done in months. Accuracy improved. Costs fell. Clerks found themselves supervising machines rather than performing endless arithmetic. The United States had taken its first step into automated governance. No one used that phrase at the time. Hollerith founded a company to manufacture and lease his machines. Over time, it merged with others, changed names, and eventually became International Business Machines, IBM. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible. There was no grand announcement that America was entering the age of data, but it had. As the 20th century unfolded, the federal government expanded. New agencies formed, regulations multiplied, wars were fought, benefits were promised. Each action generated records. Each record required classification. Slowly, carefully, the machinery of administration grew denser. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt took office during the Great Depression, the United States faced a different kind of emergency. Banks were failing. Unemployment soared. Confidence collapsed. Roosevelt's response was swift and expansive. Programs were created to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Each program required eligibility rules. Each rule required verification. Each verification required records. Social Security numbers were introduced not as symbols of identity, but as tools of organization. A number could be filed, sorted, retrieved. A person could become a data point, not in theory, but in practice. This was not done with malice. It was done with urgency. The New Deal transformed the relationship between citizens and the state, not only through policy, but through paperwork. Forms became interfaces. Compliance became routine. The system did not feel oppressive. It felt stabilizing. Then came the Second World War. The war demanded coordination on an unprecedented scale. Troops had to be tracked, supplies had to be allocated, production quotas had to be met. Factories converted overnight, schedules tightened, errors could cost lives. Data became strategic. Machines sorted draft registrations. Early computers calculated artillery trajectories. Tabulators optimized logistics. The war was not won by machines alone, but machines ensured that chaos did not overwhelm intention. After the war, these systems did not disappear. They remained. The Cold War introduced a new kind of fear, one that moved slowly and never quite resolved. Nuclear weapons, ideological competition, espionage, these required vigilance. Files grew thicker, clearances multiplied, surveillance expanded, not dramatically, but administratively. In offices without windows, analysts compiled reports that few would ever read in full. Card catalogs became databases. Rooms of machines became buildings. Buildings became networks. Citizens rarely noticed. They noticed highways, not spreadsheets. They noticed televisions, not filing systems. They noticed rockets, not algorithms. Yet behind every visible achievement was an invisible structure of data, rules, and processes that made scale possible. By the 1960s, computers were no longer novelties. They were institutional necessities. Universities taught programming languages designed not for creativity, but for reliability. Corporations optimized workflows. Government agencies standardized formats. A quiet assumption settled into American life that systems would work, that checks would be processed, that benefits would arrive, that records would be accurate. When systems failed, the response was not philosophical, it was procedural. Forms were revised, committees convened, processes adjusted.
The Internet later connected these formats together. At first, it felt chaotic, even playful. But soon, standards emerged, protocols, registries, authorities. The open frontier quietly developed rules, not imposed all at once, but adopted because they worked. Government followed, cautiously. Forms moved online, databases synchronized, redundancies were reduced, efficiency increased.
The experience became faster, though no more personal. If anything, the distance grew. There was no longer a counter, no clerk, no physical presence, only interfaces. People adapted, as they always do. They learned passwords, they learned procedures, they learned patience with loading screens and error messages. The system trained its users gently, without instruction manuals, simply by existing. Meanwhile, deep within institutions, older systems continued to run. Code written decades earlier remained active, not because it was elegant, but because it was reliable. Entire departments depended on software few fully understood anymore. Replacing it would risk disruption, and disruption was avoided whenever possible. So the old remained inside the new. This layering created a strange kind of historical continuity, past decisions living quietly inside present actions. A design choice made in the 1960s might still shape how information flows today. A constraint accepted long ago might still determine what is possible now. No one feels this directly. They only feel the rhythm: submit, wait, receive. The rhythm repeats across domains: healthcare, education, finance, travel. It becomes familiar, almost soothing. Predictability replaces understanding. Trust replaces curiosity. And perhaps that is why the system works at all, because most people do not need to understand it in order to live within it. They only need it to be there, steady and unremarkable, like infrastructure beneath a road. You do not think about the bridge while crossing it, only when it fails. Failures do occur, of course. Records are lost, errors propagate, appeals are filed, corrections are made. But even failure follows procedure. There are forms for that, too. At night, when cities dim and activity slows, the processes continue. Backups run, logs update, schedules execute. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. The system was never designed to feel alive. It was designed to persist. And persistence, over time, becomes a kind of quiet history. One without monuments, without anniversaries, without clear beginnings or endings. A history that unfolds not in moments, but in maintenance. Somewhere long ago, a clerk stamped a form and placed it in a folder. He did not imagine the future. He did not imagine networks or servers or digital traces. He was simply doing his job, carefully, correctly, because that was what the system required. And the system remembered. It remembers still. They rarely thought about where the routine truly came from. Most people never do. They experience the surface of systems, not their origins. A letter arrives, a bill is processed, a record is updated somewhere far away. Nothing feels dramatic enough to invite curiosity, and so the deeper story continues unnoticed, layer by layer, year by year. In the middle of the 20th century, as the United States settled into what many later called a golden age, the machinery of order became even quieter. Suburban neighborhoods expanded outward from cities in repeating patterns: similar houses, similar streets, similar routines. Mortgages were approved through standardized criteria. Education followed structured curricula. Careers progressed through predictable stages. Life itself began to feel administratively guided, though few would have described it that way. Behind these visible patterns were invisible files. Banks did not simply trust familiarity, they trusted records. Schools did not rely on memory, they relied on transcripts. Employers did not depend on personal knowledge, they depended on resumes and references, reduced to manageable formats. Each interaction generated data, and each piece of data joined millions of others, resting patiently in cabinets, then on magnetic tape, then on disks, then in places no one could physically point to anymore. The change was gradual enough to feel natural. In the 1950s, computers were still large, slow, and expensive. They occupied entire rooms and required constant supervision. Yet even then, institutions imagined futures in which calculation would no longer be a bottleneck. Government agencies invested quietly. Universities trained specialists who spoke in languages that sounded foreign to ordinary ears. Code was written not to impress, but to endure. The emphasis was always stability. A system that worked slowly but predictably was preferred over one that worked quickly but unpredictably. Errors were feared more than inefficiency. As a result, many early systems were deliberately conservative. They changed only when absolutely necessary. They carried assumptions from the decades in which they were designed, preserving old logic inside new technology. Time passed. By the 1970s, the United States faced new pressures: economic uncertainty, energy shortages, political distrust. Yet the administrative backbone of the country held firm. Social security checks continued to arrive, taxes were collected, licenses were issued. The system did not promise inspiration, it promised continuity. And continuity is comforting, especially at night. When computers entered homes in the 1980s, they did not feel like extensions of government systems. They felt personal. Games loaded, words appeared on screens, people typed letters instead of writing them by hand. But beneath the surface, the same principles applied. Information was structured, stored, retrieved. Order required format. This was how power operated. Not through spectacle, but through repetition. The Vietnam War exposed the limits of this logic. Metrics multiplied, body counts, sortie numbers, progress charts. Data suggested control. Reality suggested something else. The gap between what systems measured and what people experienced widened. Still, the systems endured. In the decades that followed, computers shrank and spread. Personal devices entered homes. Networks connected institutions. The language of efficiency migrated from government to everyday life. Credit scores, medical records, employment histories all became data streams. The original goal, to manage complexity, remained unchanged. By the early 21st century, Americans lived inside systems designed long before most of them were born. Systems built by committees, maintained by specialists, and trusted by default. They were not sinister, they were not benevolent, they were simply persistent. And persistence, over time, shapes behavior. People adjusted themselves to forms rather than the other way around. They learned how to answer questions correctly. They learned which boxes mattered. They learned patience with automated voices and waiting periods and standardized replies. None of this happened suddenly. It happened the way rivers change course, not by force, but by repetition. Today, when a citizen interacts with the government, the experience feels impersonal not because it lacks intention, but because it is the product of countless intentions layered over generations. No single architect designed it. No single moment defines it. It is boring by nature. And that boredom is precisely what makes it powerful. Because boredom does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It simply continues. As night falls and the country quiets, servers hum, databases update, processes run. The system does not sleep, not because it is watchful, but because it was built to persist without awareness. Long ago, clerks feared they would never finish counting the nation. They solved that problem, and in doing so, they built something that never truly stops counting at all.